Okay, now we are in the Apologetics Conference, and welcome, Professor McGrath, to yet another interview. You've had quite a bit of these.
Yes, I'm enjoying them, so let's go.
Good. If one Googles your name, he might find out that you are, quote, Andreas Idreos Emeritus Professor of Science and Religion at the University at Oxford. Let's start with that. Can you explain shortly what is the study of science and religion?
Well, really the study of science and religion is looking at how science and religion have different conversations with each other, where those conversations take us. And of course, in many ways, one of the dominant themes is this perception that there is a contradiction or a tension between science and religion, which was very, very influential about 40 years ago, but is now really fading away because we now realize it's much more complex than that. But certainly, if you like, it's about trying to establish a conversation between science and faith and asking what each can learn from each other and what the future dialogue might look like.
That's a very useful thing. The conflict thesis actually is at the popular level, for instance in Finland, still very popular. So plenty of work to be done, so to speak. What have been some of your key inputs in that field, especially during your Oxford tenure?
I think one of my key inputs in this field has been to show that there are philosophical models that allow us to understand the relationship between science and faith in very helpful and positive ways. I think it's very important to explore these things because, as you were saying, at the popular level, but not the academic level, there is this deep perception of hostility or even warfare between science and religion. So trying to establish viable philosophical models for understanding the relationship of science and faith is very important to me. But I'm also very interested in trying to explore how, for example, the development of scientific theories casts light on the development of Christian doctrines. So it's a very interesting conversation between science and faith, and I've really enjoyed helping to move that ahead.
I remember you've had a recent book specifically on that topic come out this year. What was the name of that book?
The name of that book is The Nature of Christian Doctrine, and it's really looking at how scientific theories, how they develop, what they do, gives us a very helpful way of thinking about the nature of Christian doctrine and how it develops. So it's a good example of a conversation between two different disciplines which actually casts light on some important themes.
So that as a hint to the audience, go buy that book, and I am going to buy that book for our library. The conference that you are now visiting is about the concept of miracles inspired by C.S. Lewis and his book called Miracles. Lewis is most known for his Narnia books, but the wider audience nowadays is perhaps not that familiar with his books on philosophy and theology, such as Miracles. That book has obviously many themes around the topic, and what would be those that, in your opinion, are the ones that have stood the test of time in the best way?
Well, I think Miracles is a very important book, and it really offers a critique of David Hume. But it's a very accessible and very engaging critique of David Hume's argument that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And so I think, although Lewis's book on miracles isn't read very much these days, it is very important for that reason, and also for another reason, that Lewis is very concerned to critique a materialist or a naturalist worldview, and say that this in effect simply limits reality to what we can observe and what we can see. And Lewis is simply saying that the universe is much more complex than that. We must be aware that there's far more to it than what a materialist account is able to offer.
Another book recommendation, by the way, that book is has been translated into Finnish. So go buy that book also. According to the claim popularized by the late astronomer Carl Sagan that I just saw a few days ago on Twitter or yesterday, so it goes like this: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. You said earlier that the claim originates probably from John Locke, but it has a long history, of course. And it's repeated by David Hume, I believe, also, and Lewis analyzes that also. But are there such claims, such as the miracle claims perhaps in the Bible, that are extraordinary? And if there are, do they require extraordinary evidence?
Well, I think we need to say that Carl Sagan's declaration is simply an assertion, not something that's evidenced, not something that's reliable. I mean, what decides whether something is extraordinary? The answer is it's something that doesn't fit within a worldview. And the worldview doesn't predict this, but that might simply be an indication that the worldview is wrong. And Sagan, I'm afraid, seems to be very, very inattentive to the fact that we all have certain preconceptions about the way the world is, and very often this simply leads us to say, because of our preconceptions, we don't expect this to happen. And really the issue is not whether something is extraordinary or not, because whether it's extraordinary or not is determined by our existing worldview. It is, has this happened, and if so, do we need to change our worldview? And that's the point that Lewis is making in Miracles. He's saying these things have happened. They are extraordinary, but that's because we are using a limiting materialist worldview to assess them. If we look at it from a different perspective, they're natural. And so it's in effect saying, change the map, change the worldview, and these make perfect sense.
Okay, so if we would say, for instance, that they are according to the nature of God, that would make them natural in this sense.
Yes.
Yes. Well, if a skeptic now approaches the topic of miracles with an open mind, but not yet fully decided on one way or the other, would you recommend Lewis's book, and why would you recommend that?
Well, I would still recommend Lewis's book. I think that it is very well written, it makes some very good points, and I think it is quite useful to read. There are more recent treatments of miracles that do deal with some of the more philosophical debates that have happened since Lewis's time. But because the author is C.S. Lewis, this book has a clarity which very often more recent discussions don't have. So I might say to you is, try reading Lewis first to get a sense of the intellectual landscape, and then read some more recent accounts of this, for example, William Lane Craig, and you'll find that that will help you too.
Yes, Lewis was in many ways a pioneer, perhaps, and at least in making it broadly known, the topic nowadays. Okay, if you can name, you mentioned William Lane Craig, for instance. Would there be some other books on that particular topic that a contemporary audience might be interested in?
Well, I think what I can do is give you some people who've written on this theme. Richard Swinburne, the British philosopher, is a very good example. But I think that a book which I find very, very helpful is a book by F.R. Tennant, written back in 1926, on the concept of a miracle, where again he makes very much the kind of points that Lewis is making. And he makes an additional point, which I think is really important, which is that unless and until we understand our universe completely, we're not going to be able to decide what's miraculous and what's not. Above all, we are not able to rule out something as miraculous. So that's another point to make here, I think.
That's a very helpful point. And since we have introduced quite a many of books, the last one, or some of them, for instance, this would be a very interesting take, and it's relatively recent, edited by you and Dennis Alexander, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, so which is a very... Would you have something to say about that?
Yes, well, this is a very interesting book. It's a story of 12 people who began by thinking Richard Dawkins is wonderful, he's got everything right, atheism is exactly the worldview I should be adopting. And we're looking at scientists, we're looking at philosophers, we're looking at media people, and then as they begin to think about it, they say, no, this isn't right. Dawkins is very, very disappointing. I'm disillusioned with this. I wonder if there's something better than this. And so it is a narrative. It's 12 narratives of people who read Dawkins and thought, yay, this is brilliant. And then thought, oh no, it's not. It's full of holes, and began to look for something better. So if you like, it's 12 stories of people who were disillusioned by Dawkins and thus rediscovered Christianity. And there are 12 different stories, and what we find is the people who read this book find someone in this book who sounds very much like them, and they can say, that person knows me, I'm going to follow through on that.
Some of my friends have said that Richard Dawkins was quite a gift to Christian apologetics. So go get this book as well. So hey, very much thank you, Professor McGrath, for this interview and attending the conference.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you.